So good morning. My name's Emma Jackson. I'm Head of Social Justice at Citizens Advice Scotland, and we're absolutely delighted to have you join us this morning on episode 3 of ForeCASt, our energy special. I think it feels more pertinent than ever to be talking about energy this morning, as many of us have been listening to the energy price cap announcement that's been on our televisions and radio screens this morning. And you're going to hear much more about that from colleagues as we have conversations this morning. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers from within Citizens Advice Scotland, our extra help unit, one of our bureaus, and we're delighted to have an external guest join us this morning as well. So without further ado, I would love to hand you over to our first speaker, Natasha Gilmour. Natasha is our head of Extra Help Unit, and she's going to give us a bit of an overview of both the role of the Extra Help Unit and what colleagues there have been seeing in recent months as they help to support perhaps some of the most vulnerable customers throughout the UK.
Thanks, Emma. I'm really excited to be part of ForeCASt today and tell you about our Extra Help Unit at Citizens Advice Scotland, tell you about how we deliver our service and what we achieve for people in vulnerable circumstances. So as an introduction, the Extra Help Unit is a statutory, very much person-centred service that supports people and small businesses across Great Britain with the most complex and urgent energy complaints. We're a referral-only service, and in Scotland, our main referral partners are Advice Direct Scotland, and in England and Wales, it's the Citizens Advice Consumer Service. And if you look at the back of your energy bills, you'll see the contact arrangements for our referral partners, and we're all part of the energy redress arrangements. So CAS has statutory duties and powers to support people when they're at risk of losing their energy supply or need extra help due to their vulnerability. And this may include personal circumstances such as financial vulnerability, physical, mental health issues, or life-changing events such as bereavement, divorce, where people might just need a helping hand that wouldn't normally need that. Vulnerability can be caused by the complexity of the market, such as back billing, meter mix-ups, erroneous transfers, and also the urgency of the situation can really create vulnerability when there's threatening debt follow-up, there's faulty metering, there's self-disconnection. So overall, we work in the premise that vulnerability is changeable. It's not a tick box exercise. It can be permanent, long-term, short-term, and even unexpected, and it can happen to any one of us. So very basically, we want to ensure that people get the help that they need when they most need it. So the HU is unique within the advice landscape. Energy suppliers are obligated to have arrangements in place to deal with EHU complaints, which is part of the complaint handling regulations. So we've got a duty to refer compliance concerns to Ofgem, and we're in a prime position. We're able to monitor trends and supplier behaviour across Great Britain. We're based in Glasgow with around 44 caseworkers, and the HU has been managed by CAS for the past 10 years. And in that time, we've handled over 186,000 cases and achieved over 34 million in financial redress. We've seen unprecedented change in the energy market and demand for our services over this time. So on to the next slide. How do we deliver services? So our approach to service design covers a number of key areas. At the heart of our work is advocating for the best possible outcome. We can only achieve this by understanding personal circumstances, understanding detriment caused, and we consider supplier responsibilities, and we challenge them where they failed. So we think about licence conditions, codes of conduct, have they taken vulnerability into consideration, and general customer service levels. When people reach the HU, often they've got a fear about dealing with debt, they've got a fear of dealing with suppliers. We operate a case ownership approach, so our caseworker will deal with the case from start to finish. And this allows us to build trust and rapport with the person. And our independent role provides a deeper understanding, and that helps us and the supplier find a sustainable solution. Collaborative working with our partners and energy suppliers is essential. So we offer inclusive and flexible service, and most of our engagement is through telephony and email communication, but we still offer written communication to those who prefer this or who may be digitally excluded. We're committed to continual improvement, and I'm delighted to say in the past year, we've achieved the ISO and Inclusive Service Kite Mark. We've also been embracing new technology. So we've recently introduced AI that was part of the Scottish Government CivTech programme. We partnered with Hilferty, and that's to help us identify and prioritise those most at risk in our service. Now, having this type of technology in place not only makes our working day more efficient, but it can literally save lives and staff feel more protected from safeguarding risks. And on our staff, they are central to the delivery of our service. We're quite a hard working environment in the HU. You're daily supporting people who are distressed, upset, angry, and you're trying to unpick some of the issues that they're communicating, identify ways forward. This can be challenging at times. And we work closely with our team to support them through a range of training like suicidal awareness, resilience, and we also issue a 6-monthly survey to assess wellbeing in the HU. And we ask, what are we doing well and what can we do better? Because of course we can always do better. And currently, 95% of our team reported a good sense of achievement in their role, and 93% reported positive mental health within their workplace. And we'll continue to work hard to maintain that. So our unique data and insights help us improve standards across the industry. Our evidence has been the catalyst of Ofgem compliance discussions and investigations. You may have seen last year that OVO was fined over 2 million due to failures in complaint handling, and HU was cited in this as part of the evidence that was reviewed. We work closely with our impact team at CAS and our colleagues at Citizens Advice to highlight policies and practices causing harm and detriment. And if we move on to the next slide, this is to give you an idea of demand. So since 2022, our demand has been unprecedented. And I've worked in consumer representation for more than 25 years, and demand at times has just been off the scale, very, very difficult to manage. And the biggest change that we have seen was the proportion of work that requires urgent action to keep people on supply. We call them priority cases. Priority cases were historically about 25 to 30% of our work. Since 2022, it's averaged 77%. Now that's a really powerful indicator that people couldn't afford their energy bills then, and they still can't afford their energy bills now. So sadly, it's become the norm for us to deal with that level of crisis support. And I keep tracking it every quarter, thinking it's going to reduce, and it's not budging. As much as our slides show demand and changes, the numbers never provide insight into the complexity of the issues and dealing with people with complex needs and the types of resolutions that are needed. So if we move on to the next slide around the outcomes that we achieve through the HU. So in 97% of our domestic cases, we achieve a positive outcome. That could be monetary, action-based, or a full explanation. If you think a lot of our work at the minute is self-disconnection, what we're achieving there is additional support credit for people. We're checking, is a prepayment meter actually suitable? We're checking debt repayment rates. In the past quarter, we achieved over 2 million in financial redress. That's 280 per closed case. And we're on track to achieve over 8 million by the end of this financial year. We've got a partnership in place with the Fuel Bank Foundation to access fuel vouchers, and we've got a small additional support project that helps people access support that they would struggle to access themselves. And we regularly conduct research into how people feel about our service, and our customer satisfaction results speak for themselves. So currently 94% of people are satisfied with the quality of our service. We're really strong and consistent in this area. And it's important that we highlight the emotional and the wellbeing impact that fuel poverty and complaints cause, and the positive impact our service can have. So 6 out of 10 people reported that their mental health had improved after HU support, and 8 out of 10 felt less stressed. We get inundated with comments like, "You lifted a weight off my shoulders," "You gave me a voice," "You treated me like a human being," and you can't put a price on that. And if we move to the next slides on insights, so self-disconnection has been the top category for some time. It's the same across all nations. So that's 6 in 10 currently of our complaints involve people not having enough money to top up the prepayment meter. They can't keep their house warm, they can't keep their families warm. And the volume of self-disconnection cases increased by almost 40% in Q3. So we continue to track this, and we provide insights to suppliers and Ofgem. And on the billing side, we've been highlighting failures of frontline customer service teams not applying back billing reductions and not fully investing billing errors. Another issues that we've been highlighting is on smart metering. Our analysis shows that people are struggling to get a working smart meter. There's been communication issues, and there's been issues with the in-home display units. And equally, some people don't want a smart meter, and it's quite a challenge getting alternatives to that. And should more be done to maintain legacy meter infrastructure. And on debt, we've been highlighting the inconsistencies in how people are supported, especially those on low incomes or with negative household budgets. And we've been working closely with our impact team to respond to recent consultations that Ofgem have issued on debt standards and resetting the debt landscape. So on to my final slides. Finally, let me tell you about Paul. Now, Paul is someone that we've been helping in the HU, and his situation really illustrates the complexities of billing, the difficulties people have when they've got health issues and negative budgets, and how suppliers actually can be willing to help, and they've got great initiatives, but people can't always access them when they need them. So Paul is extremely vulnerable with a range of health conditions, including a spinal condition, bowel disorder, and he's experienced suicidal thoughts at different times and has been in and out of hospital. Thankfully, Paul has carers to support him, and he relies on his electric vehicle to travel short distances for essential activities. He's also in receipt of benefits, and he manages his money very carefully because he has to. His direct debit was increased considerably despite a payment plan being in place, and this caused extreme anxiety. He could not keep up with payments and a debt built up. Paul was also confused by his EV tariff. It wasn't clear if he was on the best tariff, he wasn't sure how much energy he was using, and there was a lot of conflicting information being given by his supplier. So when the HU was trying to assist, we ran into a number of barriers. Paul was not eligible for the Supplier Trust Fund as he could not pay for his ongoing consumption, and that's because he was in a negative debt situation. Paul was not eligible for Supplier Support Scheme as he was not making payment at the point of review, but Paul was actually in hospital at this time and was unable to make payments. Paul's supplier wanted to discuss affordability, and as part of this conversation, Paul wanted to discuss tariff options, but the supplier couldn't do it because their teams weren't set up this way. So Paul also wanted a standing order payment arrangement, so he was in control of payments, but the supplier was adamant that a direct debit was the only option with a specific EV tariff. So it was clearly a number of issues that exacerbated and prolonged the resolution for Paul. However, we have managed to work closely with the supplier, and the debt has been written off. The account has been rebuilt at a better tariff. We've got a payment plan that meets Paul's needs. Food vouchers were issued. There's been a range of white goods through supplier initiatives, and we'll continue to support Paul when he needs it. What I do want to highlight is when the case was escalated to me before Christmas, Paul said to me at the end of the call, "Thanks so much. I think I'll be able to sleep now." Now that was really profound. 6 weeks later in our investigation, Paul called me in complete distress, saying he couldn't cope anymore. But thankfully, we have been able to help Paul. So at CAS, we speak about how our advice changes lives, but it can also save lives. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Natasha. Really great to hear about the breadth and depth of the work of the Extra Help Unit. And I'm sure everyone would agree that listening to Paul's experiences were both challenging, but I guess hopeful, knowing that there are things that can be done to help people when crisis is all around them. I'm going to hand over next to David Hilferty, our Director of Impact, as David walks us through what the last quarter has meant for the Citizen Advice Network across Scotland, some of the issues that we're seeing, and most importantly, what are some of the solutions that we need to see to really help people to be able to live with energy.
Thanks so much, Emma. And I think what Natasha's done really brilliant and really expertly there is detailed experience for real people here. And one of the key points that I want to stress right at the very outset is that I'm really aware that discussion around data, discussion around insight, it can feel quite theoretical, it can feel quite academic, it can sometimes feel a wee bit distant and detached. And we don't want to do that. The difference with our insight, and one of the reasons we've established ForeCASt lies in its authenticity, it's entrenched in experiences of real people, and it only exists because of the essential advice provided by the network, provided by the HU. One does not, one cannot exist without the other. And as a network, we have support people that others don't. So we see things others don't, and we see what needs to change. Our advice changes lives, as Natasha's articulated already, and that's about putting money in people's pockets. £158 million in financial gain alone. It's also about helping people sleep at night. It's also about empowering people. And that advice also offers really unique, really unparalleled insight. And how can I say that? How can I back that up? Well, first, it's immense in scale. The CAB network supports an extraordinary number of people, around 190,000 people in the last year alone. And when you do that, you build up a real vastness, a real richness of insight and understanding. The network holds the largest volume of data and insight on issues affecting people outside the public sector, and we're really determined to make that insight count. Second, just as it's immense in scale, it's equally so in terms of its depth. Our approach to advice is wraparound, it's all inclusive. We look at a person's whole set of circumstances, because I'm sure they'll attest, few problems, few experiences exist in isolation. Life is seldom neat and tidy and compartmentalised, is it? And we see that full picture. We see that issues and problems overlap and interconnect. So, well, today is a ForeCASt Energy Special. It's inevitable and indeed only right that we join up the dots to other connected areas, from homes to social security to debt advice and so on. And finally, we see who's experiencing harm, where intervention is needed most, and typically, somewhat naturally, and we've heard some of this from Natasha already today, people present for advice, present for help when something's gone wrong. And what our evidence and insight tells us at the moment is something is seriously wrong in energy. Alongside social security, if you can flick on to the next slide, please. Energy now consistently ranks among our most in-demand advice areas. Last winter, demand for energy advice overtook universal credit. That's really notable. Since the onset of welfare reforms and the fallout right through the 2010s, social security has utterly dominated demand for our services. This winter, energy was second highest advice area. Indeed, almost 1 in every 5 people who walked through our doors or picked up the phone received advice on energy issues. And to my previous point around how problems don't exist in isolation, if you received advice on energy issues, there was a right good chance you needed help with something else. 55% of people we supported on energy also needed advice on social security. Now, a key point I want to land here, it's increasing in volume, it's also increasing in urgency. If we can flip to the next slide, please. Here I've drawn out a few indicators of that. Urgency is people seeking emergency assistance. It's urgent, essential help. This isn't just nice to know stuff. Increase in people provided advice on trust fund applications, up 56% since 2022. Again, think about what that means. That's a surge in demand for people requiring charity, people requiring finite, exceptional assistance for something that's essential, for something that's so basic, so fundamental. Increase in people provided advice in relation to prepayment meters, up 34% since 2022. Again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about people requiring discretionary support, finite support, not guaranteed support, for something that is basic, something that's fundamental and essential. Now, some of you might have seen our Worried This Winter campaign, and it featured an utterly brilliant spoken word poem from a guy called Kevin McLean. And what that does, and what that does so well and so powerfully, is it captures anxiety. It captures that unrelenting pressure experienced by people behind those numbers. Here's a few lines from that. Watching the meter tick, second guessing every flick of the light switch. It's no way to live. And if you haven't managed to catch that, we're going to pop a link in the chat at the end of today. It'll probably stop you in your tracks stuff. Now, energy, of course, has been a prevailing factor, a dominant factor in the cost of living crisis over recent years. And again, I would restate, we are nowhere near out of this crisis. And moreover, the cost of living crisis wasn't this neat wee window. It wasn't a temporary moment in time. We saw that with inflation figures last week, higher than expected. Council tax increases up to 10% in some areas. Price gap increased just this morning, nearly 6.5%. None of these are isolated moments. And moreover, it's a cumulative and compounding impact on this, and the cumulative and compounding harm over a number of years. And I've said before, I'll say again, the language around cost of living has long been inadequate. Well, for some people, it means feeling the pinch a wee bit. For some folks, it means going to bed hungry. And the last ForeCASt episode, I mentioned how if you look at the BBC website, if you look at the BBC News tab, cost of living was progressively being bumped along that header at the top of the page. I checked this morning before this episode, it's not on there at all. And yet, of course, it's not over, is it? So again, I'll repeat, and we'll keep repeating, cost of living crisis ain't nearly over, and we ain't nearly out of it. But the emerging legacy is already apparent, and the emerging legacy is already clear. It's increasing, it's intractable debt. Energy debt is absolutely out of control. This slide here exemplifies that. It's more than doubled since 2020. I've said already, I said at the outset that our evidence identifies harm, it identifies what's going wrong. Something is clearly wrong here. And let's be clear, people aren't getting into debt out of recklessness, out of profligacy. This isn't about not being able to manage your money. This is people getting into debt to live, just to survive, and getting into debt because the level of income cannot sustain even very basic and essential needs. 1 in 4 people presenting with debt at CAB have energy debt. 1 in 4. And energy debt's quite unique, isn't it? Because you continue to consume even as you repay, and the meter keeps ticking. One of the things that we challenge ourselves on, and Emma mentioned this in introducing my comments, it's not enough just to say what's going wrong, and I'm very aware that I've done that over the course of the last few minutes, haven't I? It's absolutely crucial, though, that we challenge ourselves, that we challenge governments, that we challenge others to be solutions focused, that we challenge the government, that we challenge regulators to change, to be better. Again, we see things that others don't, so we see what needs to change, and it's quite easy to decry everything without being really clear about the change that's needed. So one area we've been especially vocal about is around debt write-off. Now, when debt is unavoidable, you've got a problem that's rooted within markets, not within people. Now, debt write-off is going to happen. Ofgem, the energy regulator's consulting on that now, and just last week, myself, some colleagues were speaking with our counterparts at the regulator to talk through how that will work in practice. Now, that is undeniably a good thing, but perhaps the big question in that debt write-off scheme is who should qualify? Where should the threshold be set? Now, I was always told that you shouldn't answer a question with another question, but here I can't think of doing anything else. The question's not where that threshold for support should be. The question is, how much harm are you willing to tolerate? And when I say toleration of harm, what am I meaning? Well, one example, and it's just one example, there are regrettably ample others, but it's something I can't stop thinking about. Some months ago, I was speaking to somebody who worked in outreach at a food bank. Energy, food insecurity, being unable to afford food costs, being unable to afford energy costs, inextricably connected at the moment. And I was speaking to someone, they were saying that single mum had been in earlier that day. She had a wee 2-year-old daughter, and at that time my wee boy Jack was 2, so it's immediately resonating with me. And you know those bags of grated cheese that you get in the fridges in the supermarkets? Well, she'd got that away with her as part of the food package. And she said to the person, my daughter's going to be absolutely over the moon. We've not had cheese in over a year. We've not been out for dinner as a family. We've not had a day trip. We've not been on holiday in over a year. And there's a devastating banality in that for me, where again, the everyday, the essentials are so far out of reach for people. And that to me is a toleration of harm. And through all of that meter's still ticking. We try and make clear that ForeCASt is not only a story of the numbers, it's a story of the Citizens Advice Network in Scotland. And this data, this insight, again, to reiterate, to restate that it only exists because of the advice provided in every corner of Scotland. This next visual aims to give a wee bit of insight into what we're calling the seasonality of advice demand. Some really fascinating work developed by brilliant research colleagues. Perhaps unsurprising, given what I've shared already, given what Natasha shared with you already, energy advice demand spikes at this time of year. Again, what's the backdrop for cabs at this time? Well, at the very time when the essential service is most in demand, this is when uncertainty and precarity of funding is most pronounced. We've said before, we'll say it again, at its heart, advice is about bringing stability to volatility, and yet insecure, short-term, single-year, precarious funding cycles means their own advisors' livelihoods. The essential service that's provided is marked with precarity, and that's the broader context. I think it's important for us to share here. That's what cabs are dealing with, while increasingly acting as a backstop for failure everywhere else in the system, be it energy, be it social security, and so on. Glancing at the clock, I'm aware that we're now 26 minutes into this energy special. Mentioned a lot about emergency, a lot about crisis, a lot about debt, a lot about affordability, not mentioned net zero at all, not mentioned just transition yet. And arguably that's one of the biggest, if not the biggest undertakings over the coming decades. But again, we need to understand where people are at now in order to get to where we need to be. That's the reality we've been setting out for you today. Because if you're in these circumstances, that day-to-day struggle, just to keep your head above the water, how much are you thinking about heat pumps? And how much are you thinking about heat networks? And for the second time today, I'll answer a question with a question. To be clear, why should you? Why should that mum I mentioned, with such limited bandwidth, with so much unrelenting pressure on her, be thinking about that? as the meter keeps ticking. And one of the biggest risks, though, and I address this firmly at ourselves, at regulators, at policymakers, and governments rather than individuals, would be to view these challenges of tackling poverty and reaching net zero as separate and distinct. Net zero, zero poverty, that shouldn't be an either or. Yeah, people need priority help now. That's abundantly clear, isn't it? Abundantly clear. But there's also a point at which the immediate crisis intersects with our long-term ambitions. And there's a moral imperative to ensure that households in the lowest incomes are supported to take advantage of the just transition to net zero. It can't be an afterthought. So we need to ensure that the experiences of those with most at stake here, people already paying disproportionately more for their energy, people already living in the coldest of homes, to ensure that's absolutely hardwired into ongoing work around heating buildings, around net zero delivery plans, and so on. Now, 2045 sounds a long way off. It really isn't. The clock is ticking on those climate change targets. And all the while, for the thousands of people like those whose experiences we've shared with you today, the harm's worsening and the meter keeps ticking.
Thank you so much, David, for that insight. I think in particular the graph that shows the growth of energy debt that we've seen over the last 5 years is just particularly striking. And again, something quite hard to swallow when we hear this morning that energy bills are going up again. What does that really mean for households who couldn't already afford their energy bills? We've got some great questions already coming through in the chat, but I'd encourage you to ask more. No question is a stupid question, so please put your questions in the chat and we're going to start to do our very best to answer them. But first of all, we want to hear from a couple more excellent speakers. I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Fraser Stewart. Fraser is the Just Transition Lead for Regen, a not-for-profit energy think tank organisation, and also Fraser is a member of the Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel. So we're just absolutely delighted, Fraser, to have you here with us this morning and excited to listen to some of your reflections on what you've heard this morning and both of those roles that you do at the moment. Over to you, Fraser.
Thanks, Emma. It's always, I always love listening to David speak, and I'm going to piss him off and hopefully make him happy in equal measure by, one, getting on my soapbox, but two, addressing the challenges of doing this transition in a meaningful, fair way. As with any good spiel about energy, I'd like to start with an acronym, and that acronym is WTAF. Is anyone familiar with this, either in energy or their personal lives? I'm seeing some snickers of recognition. It stands for what the actual fuck, and specifically, what the actual fuck are we trying to achieve through this energy transition? I will not swear gratuitously, it's just a product of how I grew up, but I promise it will all come back full circle. So UK government is currently going big guns on renewable energy, on the Clean Power 2030 mission, as they're calling it. And in a nutshell, Clean Power 2030 is their plan to decarbonise where we get our energy from by the end of the decade. So rather than relying on fossil fuels, getting more of our energy from the wind, from the sun and the waves. It's very much their flagship policy at this moment in time. It's about the only thing that they're willing to spend any money on. But of course, it's happening against the backdrop of an ongoing and worsening energy crisis, of rising debt, of crumbling living standards, and rampant and accelerating inequality across society and economy, not just in the energy system. But of course, these aren't separate issues, right? As we know well by now, the energy crisis, if we can take that in its silo for a second, happened because the price of gas shot up when Russia invaded Ukraine. In the UK, we were massively exposed to the negative impact of this, i.e. skyrocketing bills, because we rely so much on gas for our energy, right? And not just for our boilers. On any given day, on average, 40 to 50% of our electricity comes from gas as well across the UK. So this is the reason that even though in Scotland we've got more renewable energy than we could ever possibly use, gas still sets the price of energy more often than not. Because it's more expensive to generate gas than renewables, this makes everything more expensive, especially for those who can least afford it and who are already paying disproportionately more for their energy bills. So accelerating the transition to renewables on the big stuff side of things, the clean power mission, can help to protect us against shocks like that in future, makes us less reliant on those volatile international fossil fuel markets, and it makes cheaper renewables our main source of energy, right? So even when you factor in all the money that we need to spend building the pylons, the substations, all that kind of stuff, best estimates just now are that by 2030, if we do the clean power thing, we can bring down bills by about £100 to £300 per year, depending on who you ask. In the grand scheme of things, compared to 2021 prices, that might seem like small beans. Also take it with a massive pinch of salt, because as we know, it's difficult enough to predict energy prices in 5 months, let alone in 5 years' time. Nonetheless, some semi-positive news for the future. However, as we've already heard, doing net zero isn't just about the big tech, the turbines, the pylons, the interconnectors. It's about the boiler in your house. It's about the car parked on the street or the bus that you use sitting in the depot. And it's happening against the backdrop of more urgent and acute vulnerability than we've ever seen before, as we've heard from the previous speakers today. So how do you make it so that people can realistically participate in this whole mission when they can't afford to pay rent this month? We haven't in any meaningful way at Scottish or UK level started wrestling with this at this moment in time. And we certainly haven't gotten to grips with how people who are, no offence, middle-class homeowners, how they can make the switch, right? The middle classes can't buy us out of this crisis themselves. To do decarbonisation, to beat the climate crisis, which ultimately long-term we do have to do, we need everyone to be able to make the transition to cleaner heat, transport, all the rest, from the suburbs to the schemes and everywhere besides that. But what is abundantly apparent, and what will be more apparent to yourselves than to myself over the last few years, is that our energy system, the markets where we buy and sell our energy, from households to suppliers, right through to the big generation stuff, the policies all around it, are fundamentally not currently set up to, one, deliver changes of this scale, because everyone's operating on a fairly tight margin, unless you happen to be a big oil or gas generator, and two, to support people who need it in the most basic level today, right? So reducing bills through Clean Power 2030, that's fine, that's good, we need to do it. It'll go some way to improving outcomes for people, but it won't go anywhere near far enough to carry us all the way to fix those fundamental problems, those injustices, inequalities, and the rampant poverty that exists within the energy system connected to the issues in wider society. However, if I can be an optimist just for a minute, we do have a massive opportunity at this moment in time. I don't think it's an opportunity that exists. We're in a window of opportunity at this moment in time to meaningfully redress all the shite that we've sort of created within the energy system today, to provide not just slightly lower bills, but also to make homes healthier, to improve health outcomes for people, to offer the opportunity of community ownership or community participation to design solutions to this whole net zero transition that actually works for people on the ground, to redress transport so that it connects people better to each other, but also to different opportunities and makes it more affordable fundamentally. We're at a formative moment where everything and everything in between is changing to do this whole net zero transition, right? Whether that's the economy, whether that's the energy market, whether that's land, agriculture, food, housing, transport, everything and anything in between is up for grabs. Now, I want to caveat all of this by saying I'm not an energy guy. I'm a proud Forfar loon from the schemes of Easter Bank. I am not particularly interested in energy as a thing. I give a shit about social justice first and foremost. So for me, this energy transition, it's not a silver bullet, but it's probably the biggest opportunity any of us is likely to see to fix the issues that we see on a day-to-day basis today. So I ask you again, what the actual fuck are we doing here with the energy transition? Are we trying to just horse on with the big clean power stuff and hope that everything else then kind of slots into place? Are we trying to just make heat pumps cheaper for homeowners and hope that everyone else can eventually be able to afford the different things that need to happen? Or are we trying to change the energy system because we know it currently doesn't work for the people who need it most, so that everyone can realistically participate and reap the benefits? None of this is going to be easy, but we're not going to magically make things fairer or better just because we've made them greener or decarbonised. So for that reason, doing net zero can't just be about technology. It can't just be about going greener. It has to be about making lives better for people, for fixing those issues at the core of the energy system and the markets and all the stuff around it, so that it works for those and takes account of the lived reality of those in most extreme vulnerability at the sharp end of injustice. So in my mind, that means a few things. I've been on my soapbox for a while, so I'll wrap up. But it means a few things. It means first, recognising the experiences and challenges that people face in real life, not just giving a little nod to it here and there and saying we need this to be fair, but mandating inclusive innovation within the retail market, within the wider energy market, within technology development, and making sure that whatever we do on net zero is done with people along for the ride, people who do have the capacity and the bandwidth to participate in this, and doesn't inadvertently exclude or make things worse for those already hammered under the energy system today. We would argue, Regen and personally would argue, that net zero has to have a no detriment policy built into it for people who are in the most vulnerable situations. That is an obligation. That should be a core market metric for measuring the health of what it does going forward. It also means reshaping regulation. So we know that DESNEs are considering the role of Ofgem at this moment in time. We're also talking about Ofgem's approach to innovation. We want to see regulation reshaped to make sure that rather than just thinking about switching suppliers as a metric of market health, we want to see consumer-focused outcomes, the outcomes that people need and want to see, the outcomes that they depend on, being the core priority and the core measure for how well the energy market is doing. So making sure that we're measuring how well people are served in terms of affordability, in terms of comfort, in terms of health, access to support and recourse to action. Those should be the metrics that measure health as we go through this energy transition. But we also want to make sure on a very broad and fundamental level that we have targeted priority support for low income, for working class, marginalised people and communities to participate, also recognising the role that local, community and advocacy and advice services will play in protecting and supporting people through this transition. So David mentioned before that shift from firefighting, from crisis mode to something that's long-term, that brings together a fuel poverty strategy in Scotland and across the rest of the UK that marries up with the net zero agenda that is fundamental and central to that net zero agenda. I'll get off my soapbox now. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Fraser. A huge amount covered in a really short period of time, but we've got lots of chance for questions for folks perhaps to dig into some of those things that you've said. So if you've got any kind of questions or you want to know more about any of the things that Fraser's raised this morning, please do drop them in the chat. I'm absolutely delighted now to introduce Jen Broadhurst. Jen is the Bureau Manager of our Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice, covering a really large part of Scotland that serves urban, remote, rural and island communities. And we're really delighted to have you with us here this morning, Jen, just to hear something of what this is like on the ground for the people that you're connecting with. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for inviting me along today. Following David and Natasha's insights, as well as Fraser's passionate and colourful comments on a just transition, I'd like to share what we're seeing on the ground here in Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice Bureau, particularly through the lens of our remote communities, and highlight some of the critical policy changes that are required in our view. As you said, Argyll and Bute is Scotland's second largest local authority area after Highland, with the 5th largest sparsest population. Excuse me, around 47% of the Argyll and Bute population is classified as living in a rural area. 43% are considered to live in a remote rural location, and almost 80% of us live within 1 kilometre of the coast. 17.5% of the population here lives in one of the 28 inhabited islands, and advice provided by our advisors to clients with energy problems is complex and multifaceted within this context. Many households in Argyll don't have access to the gas network and are reliant on electricity, oil or bottled gas for their heating. And just as gas is, LPG and kerosene are subject to the price fluctuations and higher costs outlined by Fraser more often across Argyll, with many households here unable to access dual fuel tariffs as a result. Additionally, the levels of digital literacy, access to devices, Poor connectivity and poor access to support when something isn't working properly mean that those living in Argyll without ready access to the internet are unable to access discounts for online billing from their suppliers. Our data here also reflects the growing crisis that David spoke about earlier on. While regulated fuels advice makes up around 13% of our overall client support in Argyll, we're seeing an average energy debt of £2,750 per client. This is approximately 10% higher than the data recorded for the ForeCASt network nationally, and part of the staggering £3 billion in UK household energy debt. In our remote communities, these challenges are particularly acute. The most common type of energy advice provided here at the Bureau is in relation to billing or meter complications, around 47%. Around 33% are related to complaints and redress issues. And additionally, as we're also a partner to the Fuel Bank Foundation, 32% of all our energy cases are in relation to providing a fuel voucher to those in extreme poverty. Where we see an increase on the same period over the previous year of around 12%. This really demonstrates that the hardship faced by those from poorer households is enduring and not improving. The case studies selected today reflect the unique challenges faced by our remote communities, such as complex meter reading issues, poor connectivity, as I mentioned, poor supplier support, in addition to the higher than average energy debt and the higher than average cost of living here in the remote communities. When we compare to the national profile, those receiving advice on regulated fuels from our advisors in Argyll and Bute are more likely to be over 65, are more likely to be retired, are more likely to be female, are more likely to be owner-occupied, or are more likely to be living in social rented housing, more likely to live in a single pensioner household, and are more likely to live in remote rural areas. That's 57% compared to 7% nationally. Some of the case studies, I'd like to introduce you to Bill. So Bill lives in the Helensburgh and Lomond area in a rural location. He's just months away from state retirement age, had been in receipt of universal credit for 2 years with no other income. He lives alone. He saved hard and is an owner-occupier. He has several health conditions, stroke and other neurotypical conditions, no disability benefits, and is digitally excluded. His home is heated through electricity only, and he attended a face-to-face appointment seeking advice over his energy bill. He also sought advice around accessing additional support through universal credit and pressure to seek employment despite proving and providing health information and help for grants over solar panels. Bill had been trying to reach his energy supplier without success, as they had kept sending him paper bills with different amounts every few days. It was hard for him to keep up with the changes in amounts that he was owing his supplier. He had previously switched supplier the previous month and believed that he had received his final bill, having given the new supplier a meter reading. He had previously paid 3 months before and didn't believe that he owed his supplier any money based on the low appliance usage. So he was taken aback when someone came to his door asking to pay £900 for his energy bill. So he approached us, and during his face-to-face appointment, with Bill's consent, the advisor contacted his new supplier and established that the client's account was still in the registration phase and they hadn't received the opening reading either from the client or from the previous energy supplier that the client was switching from. With the reading passed given to the new supplier during the call, the switching process began there and then, and the holistic advice provided by our advisor enabled us to understand Bill's other circumstances, identified that he was eligible for energy efficiency grants, provided details and referral onto Home Energy Scotland for him to consider. So with his numerous health issues, he's months away from state pension age, yet under pressure from the DWP to find a job. The challenges of switching energy supply without digital access presented several difficulties for Bill, who turned to our Bureau in need of our holistic and wraparound advice. The advisor noted in the case file that the client had thanked him for covering his list of issues. And this case really illustrates not only the challenges faced trying to change where clients buy electricity from, but also the importance of accessible face-to-face advice where the advisor has the knowledge, the skills and the time, importantly, to support people juggling and struggling to navigate everyday issues from the first meeting and make meaningful differences to clients who come in weighed down by too many pressures. Additionally, we have Irene, who lives in one of our inhabited islands. She's, again, nearing state pension age. She lives alone in social rented housing. She works part-time on seasonably variable hours and is also in receipt of universal credit. Again, her energy is electric-only, and her social landlord had air source heat pump installed in April 2022. And while the pump was installed in 22, the client was advised to change electricity tariff to a dual rate, from a dual rate to a single rate. And the supplier informed her that a new meter was required in order to enable the change in tariff. An appointment was arranged, however, it was cancelled and no new appointment was made. The client found that she required more than £10 a day to remain in credit and heat and found that unaffordable. To put this into context, the energy was costing more than half of the client's wages, £150 from part-time work over the week. Despite numerous contacts to the energy supplier, no support was given to change the meter, and the client couldn't get off the more expensive electricity tariff, which was unaffordable for her. So she turned to the Bureau for help, and our advisor was able to ascertain that due to the client's isolated island location, the energy supplier could not advise how long it would take before the meter could be changed. In early 2023, the supplier changed, not at the client's request, but by the time the new supplier took over, they agreed that the high costs were down to having the wrong meter and unable to access any cheaper tariff. The matter trundled on and several complaints had been made, and then in April 24, 2 years into this issue for the client, she eventually had a new meter installed. Needless to say, the matter had been escalated through the Ombudsman and the complaints process. So this client lives in one of Argyll and Bute's largest islands. There's twice daily 2-hour ferry services running back and forth to the island between the mainland. And the energy supplier is a household name across the UK, and it was probably one of our longest running and most contacts. We had over 60 contacts for this particular client, but it's not the only one that the Bureau's encountered in the problem of arranging appointments for clients within reasonable timescales for suppliers. For 2 years, this client paid the price of service failure, starting with the installation of an air source heat pump from our socially rented home, and no support, no hand and glove support into the supplier issues. She was left to deal with her supplier issues on her own until her advisor stepped in. And again, this client approached the Bureau and commented as to the sleepless nights that she'd had previously before the support that we were able to put in there. So what can be done? I'd like to echo Natasha's earlier comments around the complexity and the day-to-day difficulty in advising clients in the energy advising sector, and really sort of underline the difficulty in recruiting and retaining staff in an area where it's more expensive to live and work. And as David also mentioned, the precarity around our year-to-year funding cycles means that more of our time is spent trying to achieve the necessary funding to be able to continue to support vulnerable houses that I've just outlined. And the clients that we see approaching us in increasing numbers every year really underlines the fact that we need much more sustainable funding to be able to sustain that. And as Fraser noted, the access to energy reduction measures requires to be widened and rapidly increased and improved in scope to realistically affect the sector. In particular, our experience and our data suggests that the following solutions must be considered by policymakers. There's an abject social tariff need. Our demographics tell an important story. 45% of our energy advice clients are over 65, more than double the national average. Many are living alone in remote areas where energy costs are unavoidably high. This underscores the urgent need for a progressive social tariff that accounts for unavoidably high energy requirements. It better recognises the unique challenges of remote communities in energy policy, and it ensures essential access for vulnerable houses. We need debt crisis and support. Our experience shows the current debt management approach isn't working. Clients with negative household budgets cannot realistically repay debts. The £27 annual charge to all households for debt reduction isn't addressing individual hardship. We need a comprehensive national debt reduction strategy, and we really urgently need targeted interventions and funded support for high energy debt in rural areas. We need to see protection for unprotected households in our remote areas. We see particular challenges for households using unregulated fuels like heating oil and LPG. Residents in temporary accommodation, private tenants without direct supplier relationships, and lower uptake of available support like the Warm Home Discount. These groups need equal protections and access to support schemes. Our vulnerable clients also require protection, and we're particularly concerned about the disabled clients with essential medical equipment needs, elderly clients struggling with digital devices and smart meters that they don't understand. Those facing difficulties accessing supplier support in remote and isolated locations also require support. The advice sector. As a bureau, we're spending significant time helping clients navigate these complex issues, often 30, 40 plus contacts and hours of work per energy debt case. We require better structured support for third sector advice services that values and supports face-to-face advice provision, which provides more accessible support for elderly and vulnerable clients. And we also require a vastly improved supplier engagement and customer support provision within and across our remote communities. Recognition.
That's great, Jen. I'm gonna have to bring us to a close, if that's okay. We're loving hearing all of this really great insight. The two experiences that you shared, I think, just really highlight some of the complexity of issues that you have with island, remote and urban communities. And we're definitely going to get a chance to hear more from you as we move now to our question and answer section. We've had some brilliant questions come from folks, and we really want to try to get through as many as we possibly can between now and 11:15. So my challenge to you panel members is brevity but power in your answers as we move through. So there have been a couple of questions that have come through, really folks interested about what it is when we hear some of the people's real experiences about what does engagement with suppliers really look like, what some of our experiences been like. And I think, Natasha, it would be really great maybe to hear a bit more from you about, can we make a difference on these individual levels when we engage with suppliers?
Thanks, Emma. In terms of improving processes, when we looked at Paul's situation, it was really, really clear to me that we were not, the approach wasn't person-centred. They had fantastic initiatives. There was teams in place to support people who are in vulnerable circumstances, but they didn't connect. And eligibility criteria was like, again, that tick box exercise that Paul didn't fit into at that point in time and left him vulnerable. It was a bit computer says no when there was all this support available. So it's person-centred, it's being adaptable, flexible, and making sure that, because particularly with Paul, he wanted to pay. It wasn't somebody that, you know, was not wanting to pay at all. So that's absolutely what I would say. And also, I think it is the importance of independent support at times, and that leverage and work with the supplier to get the right outcome.
That's great, Natasha. Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions that are really about some of the structural problems that are existing out there, and what are the structural barriers that are pushing people into needing emergency support. Somebody asked, where's the safety net gone? I don't know, David, Fraser, it'd be great perhaps to hear some reflections from you on that. Maybe start with yourself, David.
Thanks so much, Emma. I think I'll split that answer down into sort of two areas. The first, I would say, I'd go back to my previous comments around, none of this is happening really in the isolation, is it? None of this is really nice and neat and tidy in a vacuum at the same time as your energy bills going up inflation has surged incredibly over the last few years. Food prices, massive hikes, interest rates going up, council tax bills going up, and all the while that social security safety net has been eroded. As we know, the support that's available isn't enough to sustain people to a socially acceptable standard of living. I'd also focus in a wee bit on energy itself, and for me, for far too long, the approach to energy, and this is something that's been sort of advocated by some really high-profile public figures, was that you can switch your way out of a problem. You know, this is about switching. This is about just getting yourself on a cheaper tariff. And of course, as Fraser said, the market goes haywire, then we're keen switch to, you know. So this has always been a problem to me. It's not about individuals, it's about how the market's functioning. So as Jen said, the market needs to change. We need to see that debt write-off scheme, and I said that's coming down the line. It's much needed. The case for it is undeniable, but it needs to be far-reaching. It needs to get to everybody who needs it. Otherwise, we're going to have people in a situation where there's that constant, persistent cycle. And we need to see an affordable social tariff for energy. Jen, again, you made the case for this absolutely powerfully and effectively. I'll draw a wee bit into some of the principles of that for me. It needs to be automatic. You know, we've seen social tariffs in other markets where if you need to look for it, take up slow. This needs to be automatic. This needs to be nice and easy. Again, going back to single mum I spoke about, she's not got time to be looking at all these different market switching tariffs. And it needs to be additional. It can't just be a rehash of existing support mechanisms, because the existing support mechanisms ain't sufficient. We see that abundantly clear in the data and insight that I've shared with you already. And it needs to be targeted. A lot of the time when government are going to two ways on this, you had the Energy Bill support scheme, everybody gets it, even if you don't really need it. And then you've got other targeted forms of support that's too patchwork. You might need to be in receipt of a qualifying benefit, for example, to take advantage of some of the support. We're seeing a massive increase in single working age households who need support. And I get to come full circle with that structural piece. It's quite often because they fall right out of that social security safety net, which, as I said, has been eroded over a number of years.
Fraser, jump in.
Yeah, I suppose taking a wider lens on it in terms of the social security net, social safety net, I think in the last, if we can get political about it, in the last 15 years, we've gotten far too comfortable with the idea that austerity is in any way necessary, or just a thing that we have to do to rebalance the books or to re-stimulate economic growth. We're talking sort of pennies and pounds in terms of the money that a government can save by not properly funding advice services or not properly funding local services, leisure centres, libraries, anything in between, versus the money that is being made and that is kind of being hoovered out of the economy. Now that's been a slow progression over a number of decades from when we started to sort of sell everything off and privatise everything, and energy's not being protected from that at all. But I think this idea, and it's very, very prevalent at UK government level, both sides of the House of Commons, it's that austerity. You have to be seen to make tough choices and take the money away from certain people. We saw it with things like the winter fuel payment. You have to be seen to be able to make tough choices in the interests of economic growth. Someone has to be making money somewhere. And I think what I find very frustrating about that is that it's not as if everyone's getting poorer. An increasing amount of the general population are getting poorer and are more hard up than they have been before. But also, you know, people at the top end are making a lot more money than they've ever made before. And until we redress those sort of core priorities within the economy, so that we're thinking more about how do you make sure that people have the basic services that they need, how do you make sure people are able to spend locally and in their economy, how do you make sure that people can actually afford energy, food, rent, etc. Until that becomes the priority, not dissimilar to what we're saying about the retail market, the energy retail market, until the priority is people-centric, people-focused outcomes, we're going to struggle to redress that. So I think we're in a really, really horrible come down, a really horrible hangover of austerity that hasn't seemed to budge, and we haven't shifted the thinking at government level meaningfully enough yet to to rebuild it.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Fraser. We've had a few questions sort of around sort of demand for advice, and in particular asking if we have seen an increase in demand for help, particularly for older folks, pensioners, since we've seen the change around the winter fuel payment and the move away from a universal payment to some conditionality tied around other receipts of other parts of social security. So I guess I'm just wondering, maybe Jen, Natasha, any reflections from yourself about whether you've been helping more folks from pensioner backgrounds? We'll start with yourself, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. When the news broke towards the late autumn winter last year of the removal of the winter fuel allowance, we saw a large increase in the numbers of pensioners approaching the Bureau looking to see if they were eligible for pension credit and any other benefits that they might be entitled to. We had one or two low levels of eligibility, because for the most part the people who are approaching are just above that threshold. They're the people who were just keeping their heads above water in terms of being able to afford their day-to-day living expenses, and their private or occupational pensions that they'd worked and put into over the years that they've been working had kept them out of the bracket for support from pension credit. We are, with the high numbers of people that have come to us that are owner-occupiers, we're able to refer into Home Energy Scotland and look at energy saving methods, insulations and accessing the warm home discounts there. But for a growing number of people who have approached us, they're out of scope for pension credit and then ineligible for additional means of support from benefits.
Yeah, and a huge worry, no doubt, Jen, for your advisors when they feel like they're kind of getting to the end of the road. You know, they've used everything, all the tools in the toolbox, and there's nothing left to offer. Natasha, I'm not sure what that's looking like for yourselves in EHU in terms of demographic of folks over the last number of months.
Yeah, difficult for me to comment too much because we don't capture demographics in every case, but we actually capture demographics as part of our customer research. And just to give you an idea, 20% of people are deemed pensionable age through that. But I mean, it's always a fear that certainly with older people, there's that fear of rationing that you don't see, they won't tell you about, but ultimately they can't afford their bills. And the impact on health is, you know, as people get older, that impact is greater on their health. So yeah, it's difficult for us, Emma, to specify on demographics. Thanks.
I'll move us on to a different topic. I think, Fraser, this is maybe specifically one for you because it was something that you mentioned. We've got somebody asking, what does a no detriment policy look like in practice? Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what it was that you meant about that, Fraser?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can think about it in a couple of different elements to it, I guess. The first is affordability. So you could have a government-backed or somewhere else backed energy price guarantee that makes sure that nobody pays more when they make the switch to electric or low carbon heating versus what they're paying on gas or oil, LPG. But it's also about the service, it's about the usability of new technologies, and it's about what happens when things go wrong. So we've heard through my work on Scottish Government Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel, we've heard some horror stories, particularly remote and rural, particularly island communities, who maybe have had heat pumps installed by the local authority. I'm thinking Orkney and Shetland in this case, but they're having to wait sometimes weeks to get someone out, a qualified technician out to come and fix that to get their heating back on. That's unacceptable. And given the demographic and the geographic sort of outlay of Scotland, you're going to need to do a hell of a lot more to get more skills and more qualified people into those areas. So it links into the wider need to make sure that you've got the right people to do the installation of these technologies, but it's a guarantee on price, a guarantee on affordability, that nobody's going to pay more when they make that transition. And there's a few other things that we can do about that in terms of what sits on the energy bill or the electricity bill just now, but it's also making sure that they have the right customer service, the right recourse to action, and the right people nearby or available, readily available to come and fix things when things go wrong.
Thanks, Fraser. That's really helpful just to kind of put a bit more meat on the bones and help us to understand what that means in practice. We've had a really interesting question come in about asking us whether we think that heating is a consumer rights issue or whether we think it's actually a human rights issue. And I'm quite sure all of the panel perhaps have some reflections on that, and maybe just give a few folks a chance to reflect back on that. So perhaps go first to yourself, David, in terms of whether this is about consumer rights or our human rights.
Thanks, Emma. This isn't just about consumer rights for me. You know, this is about fundamental, essential services that shouldn't be a luxury. But as I think we've all described, and we've all been able to share some examples, and there's thousands more behind this. For far too many people, energy has become something of a luxury that you can only afford at certain points in the month, or that you go without at certain times, that you can't have the heating on when the kids come home from school. And for me, that's a situation that's utterly untenable.
Fraser, I know that I mentioned briefly as I introduced you this morning that you are a member of the Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel, and I'm sure this is potentially something that you guys have wrestled with as you've looked at the scale of fuel poverty and the harm that it causes folks across Scotland.
I think that the harm part, Emma, is exactly right, and it's where my mind goes first, and it's why it absolutely has to be treated as a human right. Energy in general should be. And if you think about sort of sustainable development goals, if you think about the global picture on energy, it's absolutely something that is being advocated for and that should be advocated for because it's transformational. But on the other side of it, as you mentioned, when you can't afford your energy, the health impacts of that, the physical impacts of that, the direct impacts on your quality of life and your ability to live at the most basic level is damaged in some cases quite horrifically. If we were thinking about anything else like that, for instance, if you think about restricting access to medicine, you're talking about a similar type of challenge, right, in terms of what it's likely to do to you. But we also have other human rights around discrimination, around how you sort of treat different groups, different protected characteristics, and the harms that could come to different people in the worst situations or who face particular disadvantage. Energy exemplifies a lot of those inequalities and those challenges as well. So I think on its own, absolutely should be a human right, but it cross-cuts with other human rights that we talk about, and I don't think we do enough to join the dots on that, I would argue.
Thanks, Fraser. I'm actually going to move us on to another topic, actually, to bring Jen and Natasha in, because I think we've seen quite a few questions bubbling up about issues around billing, around communication that individuals are finding tricky. And I think both of you mentioned something around that in the individual experiences we were discussing this morning. So someone's asking us, that a lot of the acute problems that people are experiencing can start with confusion over billing, communication coming in a way that doesn't meet people's needs. What do you think can be done by energy companies to perhaps better improve communication around billing and supporting households when the point of crisis first arises? I'll come to you first, Jen, and then move on to yourself, Natasha.
Absolutely. I think some of the things that we've mentioned earlier on around non-complex billing, making sure that it's clear and understandable, it's in plain English, first of all. I have a master's degree in research, I have PhD level of intelligence, and understanding energy billing is entirely complex and requires a amount of time to be able to sit down and focus on what is actually being conveyed to the client. When you compound that with 2, 3, 4 communications per week, each stating different amounts in different periods, that compounds the confusion and the frustration that clients are experiencing around accessing the accurate information that they're asking for. Where they then communicate to the supplier what their issue is, they're passed from pillar to post. There's no case handler that's detailed, taking them through the process. They contact somebody, they promise that it will be dealt with, and it's not being dealt with. They get another few communications within the next week, they call back, they get a different call handler, and again, somebody promising to deal with it, and the situation goes on and on. When we step into the role, quite often we'll email. We'll get things in writing in order to have an evidence trail with the supplier. Recently, we've had communications back from suppliers stating that unless we agree to remain responsible for the financial obligations moving forward, they won't look at the cases with us. It's very difficult to obtain accurate information and advice from the suppliers, and that really needs to be straightened out.
Thanks, Jen. Natasha, what about yourselves?
So billing is confusing, and to be honest, if anything, sorry, but billing is confusing, and I think it's going to get more confusing. We've got time of use tariffs coming into play. There'll be more switching taking place. The information needs to be as simplified as possible in a way that people can understand, but equally it is quite a complicated methodology to explain, and people might go, right, so I'm not happy with my bills, it's not right. And then you're trying to look at maybe 1 year, 2 years of billing. I mean, even in the HU, we at times have had to dedicate a dedicated billing specialist to try and understand some of our most complex cases. So it really is quite a difficult area in terms of communication. And then when you think about people's levels of sort of English and maths and all the rest of it, trying to work that out. So yeah, very much person-centred, when making sure that when people need that extra support, there's a lot of people that think that energy bills are wrong, but actually they just don't understand them.
Thanks, Natasha. Jen, really shows us the importance of good billing, good communication. We are running out of time this morning, so I'm going to abuse Chair's privilege with the final question before we finish today. And panel, you're going to need to be brief. I would love one sentence kind of answers. Let's imagine, for the purposes of this morning, that perhaps Mr. Miliband has joined this call, and if you were able to make one ask to the UK government about what one thing that they could do that that would dramatically improve the things that you're seeing in your space, what would that be? One ask. I'm going to go round the room to David, Natasha, Jen, and then Fraser. So just seamlessly kind of pass yourself each on. So David, what's your one ask?
Sam, I think you know me well enough by now to know I don't do ones, but I do threes, and I'll do 3 rapid. Debt write-off, social tariff. Third one's a bit more vague, bit more imagination. Scale of this problem ain't about mitigation and bolt-ons. If you're starting with a blank page, we wouldn't have what we've got now. So, bit of imagination to meet the scale of the problem.
Social tariff for me, it would give people a sustainable way of paying for their energy.
Yeah, social tariff and supporting the advice sector.
Burn it all down and start again. No, I agree with social tariff, but I guess as we're changing all the sort of how we do retail, how we do supply, we're sort of revisiting all those regulations. I think a shift away from things like switching as a metric for health and more on to delivering against consumer focused, people focused outcomes like affordability, like health, has to be at the ground floor.
Well, maybe there is something in burning some of it down, Fraser. Friends, we are out of time this morning. As you'll see, my colleague Nicole has just popped into the chat just a really brief evaluation form. So before you leave the call this morning, just absolutely love it if you could click on that and just kind of 30 seconds. We can really do love to get your feedback. Thank you so much for choosing to spend this morning with us to have great conversations. Thank you for your questions and for your engagement. Thank you so much to David, to Natasha, to Jen, to Fraser. It's been wonderful to have these conversations this morning and to keep thinking about the solutions that we need to our energy markets. We'll see you again. Thanks so much, folks. Bye-bye.